My 62nd birthday should have been a celebration, but instead it became the night I will never forget. When my daughter saw the $100 bill I gave my granddaughter, she laughed in front of 200 guests and said, "What are you going to do with this money? Go shopping?" It's just like him now, broke, worthless, obsolete. I stood there in silence, humiliated while everyone stared. But she didn't know that I wasn't weak or broken. In that moment, I made a decision that would change everything. A decision that could destroy her entire world. I'm grateful you're here with me today. Before we begin, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop a comment below with your city or country, and let's see how far this story travels. Also, a quick note. This narrative contains some fictional elements crafted for reflection and insight. Any similarities to actual names or places are unintended, though the lessons within may prove valuable to those who listen. The crystal chandeliers of the apex cast golden shadows across white tablecloths, but I already felt the chill creeping in. Not from temperature, but from people you thought you knew. 35 years building Vanguard systems from a garage startup into a $350 million empire. Tonight was my 62nd birthday celebration. Instead, it felt like attending my own funeral. Edward Morrison. My attorney and friend for 35 years leaned close as we stepped onto the 42nd floor. "Are you sure about tonight?" I adjusted the Patek Philippe on my wrist, feeling the weight of what was hidden inside. I've never been more certain. The private dining room stretched before us, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering views of San Francisco Bay. At the center, at a 12-seat table, sat my family. Sienna didn't stand when I entered. She barely looked up from her phone, her Dior dress and $45,000 Cartier necklace catching the light. Gifts I'd bought when I thought money could buy loyalty. Bradley, her husband, offered a tight smile. His Tom Ford suit was immaculate, his new Rolex Daytona gleaming. I hadn't bought him that one. Then I saw Sophie, 11 years old, wearing a simple Target dress. She met my eyes and smiled, and suddenly the coldness didn't matter. I crossed to her first, not Sienna. "Hello, sweetheart." Sophie hugged me fiercely. "Happy birthday, Grandpa Rick." Sienna's voice cut through. "Sophie, sit down. You're blocking the view." I felt Sophie stiffen. Saw something in her eyes. Guilt. Fear. Edward and I took our seats. 200 guests filled the room. Executives, partners, board members, venture capitalists, San Francisco society elite, greeting me with polite smiles and hollow congratulations. Dinner proceeded in courses. Oysters, scallops, Wagyu beef. But I was watching. Sienna laughed too loudly, playing devoted daughter and successful executive. But I'd seen the bank statements Edward obtained. $12 million missing, shell companies, fake invoices, Cayman Islands accounts. Bradley checked his phone constantly. I thought about the $2.8 million art collection that vanished from Vanguard offices. Security footage showed Bradley supervising their transfer to storage. No storage facility had any record. Sophie worried me most. She picked at her food, glancing between Sienna and me like she carried a secret too heavy for 11-year-old shoulders. 8:15. Sienna stood tapping her wine glass. "I'd like to thank everyone for celebrating my father's birthday. 62 years old. Retirement looks good on you, Dad." I wasn't retired. She'd convinced me 5 years ago to step back, move into the guest house, let her handle operations while I recovered. Recovered from what I hadn't known then. Now I did. Hair loss, trembling hands, confusion, all symptoms of chronic arsenic poisoning. Doctor. Sarah Bennett's report was clear: 5 years of sublethal doses carefully calibrated to make me seem incompetent. Sophie stood clutching a painting to her chest. "Grandpa Rick, I made you something. Watercolor on thick paper. 2 figures before the Golden Gate Bridge. Remarkable detail for an 11-year-old. At the bottom, to Grandpa Rick, thank you for always listening. I love you, Sophie." Something broke in my chest. This is the most beautiful gift I've ever received, sweetheart. Sophie's smile was pure sunshine. Then Sienna's voice. Sophie, sit down. You're blocking the view. The smile died. I stood, pulled out a cream-colored envelope from my jacket. Walked to Sienna, placed it before her. For you. She opened it with manicured nails, pulled out a single $100 bill. Old paper, slightly yellowed. I spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. That's a 1934 silver certificate. Collectors would pay $18,000 for it. Real value isn't always obvious, Sienna. Sometimes the things that look ordinary are the most precious. Silence stretched across the table. Sienna stared at the bill, then laughed. Cold, dismissive. $100, are you serious? She stood holding it between two fingers. What am I supposed to do with this? Buy groceries. This is exactly like you right now. Worn out, worthless, outdated. She walked to the trash can at the bar. The bill hit the bottom with a soft thump that echoed in silence. Sophie put her face in her hands, shoulders shaking. Edward's hand gripped mine under the table. I remembered 32 years ago. My sister Eleanor dying in a hospital room. Her 3-year-old daughter crying in the corner. Eleanor's last words, promise me you'll take care of her. I'd raised that little girl as my own. Given her everything. Tonight she'd thrown me away in front of 200 people, but it wasn't the humiliation that decided things. It was Sophie's face. I stood, walked to the trash can, retrieved the $100 bill, folded it carefully, tucked it into my vest pocket. I turned to Sienna. Thank you for clarifying things. I've been wondering what you really thought of me. Now I know. She rolled her eyes. Don't be so dramatic. I'm not your father anymore. By tomorrow morning you'll understand why. I walked out. Sophie ran after me, arms wrapping around my waist. I'm so sorry, Grandpa. I knelt, held her. None of this is your fault, sweetheart. In the guest house, I removed the Patek Philippe, pressed the crown twisted counterclockwise 3 times. The case back popped open, revealing a micro SD card. That's everything, Edward asked. Everything. Trust documents, access codes, evidence files, 2 years of preparation. I opened the file labeled the Sterling Protocol. By 8 tomorrow morning, every account with her name reads 0. Every login denied. Every door locked. Are you ready for what comes next? I thought about Sophie's painting, about the $100 bill, about 5 years of arsenic. She thought exiling me here made me invisible, but invisibility is the greatest weapon. Outside, the main house glowed. Sienna was celebrating, planning her next move. She had no idea the feeble old man she'd poisoned had spent 2 years. The guest house felt different at 1147, not smaller but sharper, like a blade being honed in the dark. 5 years I'd lived here, exiled to a corner of my own property, while Sienna and Bradley occupied the 12,000-square-foot mansion. Tonight I would turn that exile into a weapon. The Patek Philippe sat on the desk, its cream dial glowing under the single lamp. My father's watch passed to me in 1995. Tonight I needed what was hidden inside. I pressed the case back with my thumbnail. The mechanism released with a soft click, revealing a small, custom-machined cavity. Nestled inside was a Samsung 16GB micro SD card, no bigger than my fingernail, wrapped in static-proof sleeve. 2 years of preparation. Every blood sample sent to private labs under false names. Every financial document photographed after hours. Every conversation Edward encrypted and stored. Sienna thought I was weak. She'd been wrong. I slid the card into the MacBook Pro on my desk, a 2019 model I'd kept offline and encrypted since purchase. I typed the 24-character password I'd memorized but never written down. 3 folders materialized. Trust_documents, 85 files. Evidence, 340 files. Contingency_plans, 12 files. I opened trust_documents first. The Sterling Family Revocable Living Trust appeared 217 pages, drafted 10 years ago when Vanguard Systems hit $300 million in valuation. The structure was elegant. I'd served as both grantor and trustee, retaining absolute control over every asset during my lifetime. Total value $585 million. Beneficiaries Sienna Sterling 60%, Sophie Sterling 40%. Buried in Section 7, subsection D, was the clause Edward and I had designed over a bottle of Macallan the Sterling Protocol. 3 triggers for activation. Elder abuse, any act causing physical or psychological harm to the grantor. Financial exploitation, unauthorized use or misappropriation of trust assets. Public humiliation or reputational damage to the grantor, materially affecting his standing in the business community. Tonight, Sienna had hit all 3. The consequences were automatic and irreversible. Immediate removal of Sienna Sterling as beneficiary. Immediate freeze of all accounts and assets bearing her name. Immediate restoration of full control to Richard Sterling as grantor and trustee. Immediate protection of Sophie Sterling's interests with guardianship review to follow. I read the clause 3 times, searching for loopholes. Found none. At 12:17, I called Edward's private line. He answered on the first ring. "You're sure?" His voice was steady, but I caught the edge beneath it. 35 years of friendship. He knew what this would cost me. I'm sure. She threw an $18,000 collector's note in the trash in front of 200 people because she thought it was worthless. She called me worn out and outdated. Sophie was crying, and Sienna didn't even look at her. "That's the public humiliation trigger," Edward said. "We'll need the others documented. I've got 2 years of blood work showing arsenic exposure. Samples stored at 3 different labs under sealed chain of custody. That's elder abuse. And I've got Marcus Whitmore's forensic accounting $12 million in embezzlement over 5 years. That's financial exploitation." $12 million, Edward's voice sharpened. "You didn't tell me it was that much. I wanted to be certain before I moved." I pulled up the evidence folder and scrolled through Marcus's files. Fake vendor invoices. Unauthorized wire transfers to offshore Cayman accounts. Bonuses Sienna paid herself without board approval, each just under the audit threshold. Marcus finished his report 3 days ago. $42 million in liquid assets currently under Sienna and Bradley's control. I want every dollar frozen by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. 8 o'clock. That gives me 7 hours and 43 minutes. Can you do it? Richard, I've had the court filings ready for 6 months. All I need is your signature on the activation documents, and I can file electronically by 2 o'clock. Judge Patricia Cross owes me a favor. She'll issue the freeze order by 5, and the banks will execute by 8. But once I file, there's no taking it back. Sienna will lose everything. Her access to Vanguard, her trust distributions, her credit cards, her apartment, her voting shares. Sophie's 40% will be protected, but Sienna's 60% reverts to you as grantor. Are you ready for that? I thought about Sophie's painting. A house with a red door and 2 stick figures holding hands. I thought about the way Sienna had smirked, dropping my father's banknote into the trash, the way Bradley had laughed, the way 200 guests watched while an 11-year-old girl realized her mother was capable of cruelty. I've been ready for 2 years. File the documents. Consider it done. Edward paused. There's one more thing. The board meeting tomorrow at 9. Sienna's going to walk in expecting to run the show. She holds 27% of Vanguard's voting shares, and she's been collecting proxies from smaller shareholders for weeks. She thinks she has the votes to push you out entirely. She doesn't know about the trust freeze yet. No, but she will by 8:02 when her Platinum Amex gets declined. By 9, she'll be furious. You need to be ready. I will be. I glanced at the contingency _plans folder. One file was labeled board_meeting_scenario_3. We'd wargamed this too. I'll be at the office by 7:30. Make sure building security has my updated access credentials. Sienna changed the locks on my executive suite 3 weeks ago. I already handled, Edward said, and Richard. For what it's worth, I'm sorry it came to this. So am I. I ended the call and closed the laptop. By 2:45, I'd packed a single bag and locked the guest house behind me. I drove through empty Pacific Heights streets toward the Grand Pacific Hotel on Nob Hill. I'd reserved a penthouse suite under the name James Crawford paid cash, arranged for a 7 o'clock wake-up call. No one would think to look for me there. As I handed my keys to the valet, I thought about what Sienna would feel when she woke up in 6 hours. She'd reach for her phone and see 17 notifications. Bank of America account frozen. Chase card declined. Vanguard Systems building access denied. Her American Express, her Tesla lease, her private gym membership, her Wall Street Journal subscription, every digital thread of her life severed in 2 minutes. By 8:02 tomorrow morning, Sienna would understand what I'd known since the moment that banknote hit the trash. The man standing in front of her wasn't the foolish old father she'd been poisoning for 5 years. She'd been playing a short game. I'd been planning the long one. And tonight the clock ran out. At 8:02 in the morning, Sienna's iPhone shattered the silence with 17 notifications in rapid succession, each chime a death knell for the empire she thought she'd inherited. I wasn't there to see her face, but Edward had installed surveillance equipment in the guest house 6 months earlier, and the audio feed gave us everything we needed. By 8:05, I was sitting in the penthouse suite on the 48th floor of the Grand Pacific Hotel, a cup of coffee in my hand. No arsenic. For the first time in 5 years, listening to Edward narrate the collapse in real time. She's awake, Edward said through the secure line. First notification just hit. Bank of America. I imagined Sienna reaching for her iPhone 14 Pro Max. The screen would be glowing with alerts, each one worse than the last. Bank of America account ending in 4782, balance $0.00. Morgan Stanley investment portfolio liquidated per trust directive. American Express Platinum suspended. Chase Sapphire Reserve account closed. Cayman International Bank account frozen. Contact administrator. Vanguard Systems building access. Login denied. Credentials revoked. 17 notifications. $42 million erased in 90 seconds. She's calling the bank, Edward reported. I heard Sienna's voice through his feed rising in pitch. They're telling her the account was frozen at 12:21 this morning per trust directive issued by Richard Sterling, grantor and trustee. I took a sip of coffee. It tasted better than anything I'd had in 5 years. What's she saying? She's screaming, quote, "That's my money. Unlock it right now," unquote. Edward paused. She's calling Morgan Stanley now. Same result. Now Chase. Now Amex. She just threw her phone at the bed. Screen's cracked. She's running downstairs, barefoot. I could picture it perfectly. The 2,500 square foot master bedroom, the California king bed, with $1,200 Egyptian cotton sheets. The walk-in closet full of Dior and Chanel. Sienna had lived like a queen, never wondering whether the kingdom beneath her feet was built on sand. Now the tide had come in. Hachatik. Bradley just discovered his Cayman account. Edward continued. He's reading an email from Cayman International Bank. The account's frozen per request from the FBI Financial Crimes Unit. I heard Bradley's voice join Sienna's tight with panic. What did you do? That was Sienna shrill. Did you steal from him? You're the one who threw him in the trash last night. That was a stupid old bill. This is $42 million. He froze my Cayman account. The FBI's involved. We're finished. Long silence broken only by Sienna's breathing. She's moving again, Edward said. Heading outside, toward the guest house. I walked to the window. Somewhere below, Sienna was running across the courtyard toward the 600-square-foot prison she'd exiled me to 5 years ago. She'd find it empty. "Guest house is clean," Edward confirmed. "No clothes, no laptop, no documents, just the furniture." She's checking the Patek Philippe display case empty, checking the desk drawers empty. She's standing in the middle of the room, now turning in circles. I closed my eyes and felt it the moment Sienna realized I hadn't just left. I'd vanished. "She's calling your cell," Edward said. "I heard the faint recorded message. The number you have dialed is currently unavailable. Now she's calling my office. My secretary's telling her I'm in meetings all day." Sienna just hung up. "What time is it?" 8:43. "She'll hire someone to find me." "Already happening. She's calling someone now." A pause. "Tony Russo, ex-NYPD, charges $500 an hour plus expenses." I heard Sienna's voice. "I'll pay double. Just find him." Russo's response was dry. "How are you paying if your accounts are frozen?" Long pause. Then Sienna said, "I have jewelry. A Cartier necklace, retail value $45,000. Bring it to my office. I'll see what I can do." Edward chuckled softly. "She's liquidating assets. Where is she now?" "Back in the guest house, sitting on the bed." "She's alone." Bradley stayed in the main house. Edward's voice shifted. "Richard, she's talking to herself. She just said, 'How long has he known about the money, about the pills, about everything?'" I went very still. "The pills." Bradley just walked in. He heard her. He's asking, "What pills?" "What did she say?" "She said nothing. Forget it." Edward exhaled slowly. "She's covering, but she's rattled. She knows you know about the arsenic." I looked out at the bay, at the white sails cutting through the water. Sienna had spent 5 years poisoning me, thinking I was too old and too foolish to notice. She'd stolen $12 million, thinking I was too trusting to check the books. She'd been wrong about all of it. "Let her panic," I said. "Panic makes people sloppy." She's leaving the guest house now, heading back to the main house. She's carrying the Cartier necklace. A pause. "Do you want me to keep monitoring?" "For now. Let me know if Russo makes any progress. He won't find you. James Crawford doesn't exist." I know." I finished my coffee. "But Sienna doesn't know that yet. Let her spend the next 24 hours chasing ghosts. By the time she realizes I'm 3 moves ahead, it'll be too late." "What's the next move?" I thought about the micro SD card in Edward's office safe, about the 85 trust documents, and 340 pieces of evidence. I thought about Marcus Whitmore's forensic accounting report, about the blood samples stored in 3 separate labs. But most of all, I thought about Sophie's diary. Every time Sienna told her to be quiet. Every time Sophie cried herself to sleep. Sienna didn't know about the diary. She didn't know that 3 months ago, Sophie had brought it to Edward's office and asked if she was allowed to testify against her own mother in court. Edward had told her yes. "The next move," I said, "is letting Sienna think she still has time to fix this. Because when she's finally desperate enough to come looking for the truth, she's going to find it in the last place she'd ever think to look." "Where's that?" "In Sophie's bedroom," I said, "in a pink notebook hidden under a loose floorboard beneath the window seat." The guest house had been my prison for 5 years, not because the doors were locked, but because something far more insidious was dissolved into my morning coffee at precisely 7:30 every day. Now, on the second afternoon since I'd walked out of the Apex, I sat in the penthouse suite of the Grand Pacific Hotel with Edward Morrison. A 47-page toxicology report spread across the desk between us. Chronic arsenic trioxide exposure. Edward read aloud, his voice tight. Consistent with low-dose poisoning administered over an extended period. Estimated duration 5 years. Estimated daily dose 5 to 10 milligrams. Purpose cognitive impairment, physical debilitation, and establishment of incompetence for guardianship proceedings. I'd known this was coming. I'd paid $3,500 in cash 6 months ago to hear Dr. Sarah Bennett say those exact words at Stanford Medical Center using the name James Crawford. But hearing Edward read it aloud made it real. 5 years, 1,825 days, 1,825 cups of coffee, each one laced with just enough poison to destroy me slowly. Tell me how it started, Edward said quietly. 5 years ago, I'd been 57, still running Vanguard systems. Sienna had come to me with a proposal. Dad, you've been working yourself to exhaustion for 35 years. You deserve rest. Let me handle day-to-day operations. You can step back, move into the guest house where it's quieter. Focus on your health. I'll take care of everything. I'd been touched. I'd agreed immediately. The move happened within a week. And every morning at 7:30, Sienna would appear at my door with coffee. French press, she said. Jamaican Blue Mountain beans. I want to make sure you start your day right, she'd told me, kissing my cheek. The symptoms started 2 months in. Fatigue, headaches, nausea, trembling hands, hair loss. My skin took on a grayish cast that made me look a decade older. Doctors ran tests and found nothing conclusive. Age-related decline, they said. Stress. Maybe early-stage Parkinson's. One neurologist suggested dementia. I'd believed them. For 4.5 years, I'd believed them. But 6 months ago, I'd knocked over my coffee cup before taking a sip and spent the day cleaning up. By evening, I realized something. I felt better. Clearer. The tremors had lessened. The fog had lifted. The next morning, Sienna brought coffee as usual. I drank it. By noon, the symptoms were back. I'm an engineer. I understand patterns. The following week, I drove to Stanford Medical Center. I paid cash and used the name James Crawford. I asked for a comprehensive toxicology panel. Dr. Sarah Bennett called me 3 days later. Mr. Crawford, your arsenic levels are significantly elevated. This is consistent with chronic low-dose exposure over a prolonged period. Someone is poisoning you. How long? Based on your levels, I'd estimate 4 to 5 years. The doses are calibrated carefully enough to cause serious symptoms and cognitive impairment, but not enough to kill you quickly. Whoever's doing this knows exactly what they're doing. What's the goal? In cases like this, usually to establish incompetence. The symptoms mimic dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's. If someone wanted to have you declared mentally unfit, this would be an effective method. Guardianship fraud. Sienna wasn't just trying to make me sick. She was trying to make me incompetent so she could take legal control of everything I owned. I should have confronted her immediately. But something Edward had taught me stopped me. Never move until you have all the evidence. So I didn't confront her. Instead, I continued drinking the coffee. I let her think her plan was working, and in secret, I began collecting samples, blood, hair, urine, and portions of the coffee itself, which I stored in a hidden freezer compartment. I documented everything. I sent samples to 3 different labs under sealed chain of custody. I built a case, but I wasn't the only one documenting. 3 months ago, Sophie came to me on a Saturday morning carrying a pink spiral notebook. Her hands were shaking, tears on her cheeks. Grandpa Rick is mommy trying to hurt you. My heart stopped. What do you mean, sweetheart? She opened the notebook. Page after page of careful handwriting, dated and timed. Day 14. Mom poured white powder from a small jar into Grandpa's coffee. She smiled when his hands shook at breakfast. Day 29. Grandpa threw up after drinking his coffee. Mom told him he was getting old and should see a neurologist. Day 47. I found the jar in Mom's bathroom cabinet. The label is scratched off. I took a picture. 180 entries, 47 photographs of a small amber jar with the label removed, 4 short videos showing Sienna at the kitchen counter at 7:20 in the morning, measuring white powder into my coffee cup. Sophie had been documenting Sienna's poisoning for 6 months. "I didn't know if I should tell you," Sophie said, crying. "She's my mom. But she's hurting you, and I don't know what to do." I pulled her into my arms. "You did the right thing, sweetheart. You just saved my life." Now, sitting in the hotel penthouse with Edward, I watched him page through the forensic report. 47 pages of medical evidence. "This is a federal case," Edward said. "Elder abuse. Attempted murder, potentially. Combined with the guardianship fraud angle and the financial crimes, this could put her away for 20 years. "What about Sophie's diary?" Edward pulled out a thick manila folder. I had it scanned and authenticated. 180 pages. Every entry is dated, timed, and cross-referenced with your toxicology results. The photographs are time-stamped. The videos have metadata. He paused. "She's going to be the star witness." I thought about Sophie's face when she'd asked me if her mother was trying to hurt me. The fear in her eyes. The way she'd promised she wouldn't let Sienna hurt me anymore. 32 years ago, I'd promised my dying sister I'd raise her daughter as my own. I'd kept that promise. I'd given Sienna everything, and she'd repaid me by poisoning me for 5 years, forcing her own daughter to become a witness to her crimes. But Sophie, my true granddaughter, had used her courage to save me. I walked to the window looking out over the city. Somewhere out there, Sienna was scrambling, still trying to figure out where I'd gone. She had no idea that in 36 hours, I'd walk into a federal courtroom with 47 pages of toxicology evidence and 180 pages of an 11-year-old's diary, and destroy her completely. "What's next?" I asked. Edward closed the folder. "Tomorrow we meet with the federal prosecutor. Then we spring the trap." I looked down at the evidence. 47 pages of medicine. 180 pages of a child's love. Together, they were a weapon Sienna couldn't survive. And in 36 hours, she'd finally understand the man she'd been poisoning for 5 years wasn't weak. By mid-morning on the 3rd day, Sienna's panic had crystallized into something far more dangerous. A plan to erase me entirely through the very legal system designed to protect the vulnerable. I wasn't in the drawing room when she and Bradley began plotting. I was 48 floors above the city in the Grand Pacific Hotel. But I didn't need to be there. 2 years ago, I'd installed 3 microphones in the drawing room, devices smaller than shirt buttons, transmitting everything to an encrypted server Edward controlled. Now at 10 o'clock. Edward sat across from me with his laptop open, and we listened to my daughter plan my destruction in real time. "We've been locked out for 48 hours. Bradley's voice came through the speakers, tight with desperation. $0 in every account. The FBI is tracking my offshore account. We're running out of time." Then we stopped looking for him. Sienna's voice was cold, controlled. "There's only one way to get control back. We declare him incompetent." "So on what grounds, Kaitan?" "We say he's having a mental health crisis. Dementia. Alzheimer's. We file for emergency guardianship in California Superior Court." I'd known this was coming. It was the natural endgame of 5 years of arsenic poisoning, but hearing her say it out loud made it real. "That requires a medical evaluation," Bradley said. "A licensed physician has to certify he's incompetent. Then we find a physician who'll write what we need. Dr. Martin Keene. He used to have privileges at Bay Pacific Medical Center. His license was suspended twice. Overprescribing opioids, Medicare fraud. He's desperate for money. He'll do it." Edward typed rapidly, pulling up Dr. Keene's records on screen. "What's the plan?" Bradley asked. "Dr. Keene writes a report stating my father has severe dementia and is unable to manage his own affairs. He backdates it 6 months. We file for emergency guardianship. I'm appointed temporary guardian with full authority over his estate. Once I have control, I revoke any changes he made to the trust. And if he contests it, that's why we need the 72-hour psychiatric hold. If he resists, we have Dr. Keene standing by with sedatives and a police escort. Once he's in the system, it takes weeks to get out. By then, we'll have permanent guardianship. This is illegal. The SO is embezzling $8 million from your father-in-law's company. You want to worry about legality now. Silence. Then Bradley. How much is Keene going to cost? $75,000 up front. $25,000 bonus if guardianship is granted. We don't have $75,000. I'll sell the Monet in the upstairs hallway. It's worth $90,000. I can have cash by 5 o'clock today. Edward paused the recording. She's selling your art to pay a corrupt doctor to commit medical fraud against you. Keep playing, I said. At 11:30, a man's voice. Ms. Sterling, I'm Dr. Keene. Thank you for coming. I need a medical evaluation of my father, Richard Sterling. He's 62, exhibiting signs of severe dementia. I need documentation to file for emergency guardianship. You need me to examine him. I need you to write a report stating he's incompetent, whether you examine him or not. Long pause. That's medical fraud. If I'm caught, I lose my license permanently. You'll lose more than your license if you don't pay off your debts. I know about Vitali. I know you owe him $200,000. I'm offering you a way out. $75,000 cash today. $25,000 more when guardianship is granted. Another pause. What exactly do you need? A medical evaluation report stating Richard Sterling has severe dementia-impaired judgment and is unable to manage his financial affairs. Backdate it 6 months. Make it convincing. When do I get the $75,000? Today, 5 o'clock, cash. I'll have the report ready by tomorrow morning. Edward stopped the recording. Rick, this is conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud. Medical fraud, false imprisonment. This is federal. At 1 o'clock, Sienna and Bradley returned to planning. How do we get him to show up for the evaluation? Bradley asked. What we use Sophie. My hands clenched into fists. She's your daughter, Bradley said quietly. She's also his weakness. We tell Sophie that Richard collapsed and is refusing medical care. She'll call him panicked and crying. He'll come running. When he arrives at Bay Pacific Medical Center, Dr. Keene will be waiting with the evaluation forms and a police escort. Edward gripped my shoulder. Rick, let her finish. I need everything on tape. Edward closed the laptop. We have everything we need. Conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, medical fraud, intent to falsely imprison, using a minor as an instrument of fraud. Good. I walked to the window. What about Sophie? I called her at 6 this morning. Told her Sienna might try to use her to find me. She knows to play along, but not to actually call me. And Dr. Keene, so he's the weak link. The moment he realizes he's facing federal charges, he'll flip. That recording we just heard, that's his confession waiting to happen. Edward stood beside me. How did you know she'd go this route? Because it's the only route left. The arsenic was never meant to kill me. It was meant to make me look like I had dementia so she could take guardianship. I forced her hand. Now she's desperate. And desperate people make mistakes. Why, she's planning to use her own daughter. Sophie documented 5 years of poisoning to save me. Sienna's planning to weaponize Sophie's love to destroy me. That's the difference between them. What's next? We let Sienna execute her plan. Let her pay Dr. Keene. Let her file the petition. And when it all falls apart, we'll have everything we need to bury her in federal court. I looked at the screen one last time. Every word was evidence. Every plan was a confession. And this isn't a bluff, Edward, I said. This is a siege. And we've already surrounded them. Edward's war room occupied the entire 47th floor of the Harrington and Sterling building, a fortress of mahogany glass, and the kind of legal precision that only 35 years of friendship could forge. By 3:30 that afternoon, I stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking San Francisco Bay. While behind me, Edward assembled the team that would destroy Sienna's conspiracy from the inside out. The conference room stretched 30 feet, dominated by a 12-seat table of reclaimed California redwood. 4 people sat waiting, each one a specialist Edward had recruited over the past 6 months. I'd met none of them until today. That was intentional. Team Edward said, standing at the head of the table, "We're building a federal elder abuse case against Sienna Sterling. We have 72 hours before she attempts to file fraudulent guardianship paperwork based on a fake medical evaluation. Our goal is simple: compile ironclad evidence that results in federal arrests, not civil penalties." I turned from the window. I don't want a settlement. I don't want her resignation. I want her in federal prison. Is that clear? Yes, sir, they said in unison. Edward made introductions. Jennifer Hayes, 42, forensic accountant, ex-IRS Criminal Investigation Division. She'd brought 3 laptops and 12 banker's boxes filled with 5 years of Vanguard Systems financial records. Marcus Whitmore, 38, ex-NSA cybercrimes analyst specializing in digital forensics. Dr. Sarah Bennett, the toxicologist from Stanford Medical who'd confirmed my arsenic poisoning 6 months ago. Thomas Reed, 50, ex-FBI white-collar crimes investigator. He'd helped Sophie preserve her diary evidence. For the next 4 hours, I watched my life be dissected into evidence. Jennifer started with the money. Total embezzlement, $12 million over 5 years. $4.2 million through fake vendor invoices. Sienna created 37 shell companies, most registered in Delaware. $3.8 million in unauthorized executive bonuses. $4 million in direct offshore transfers to Cayman International Bank. We have paper trails for every dollar. Dr. Bennett went next. Arsenic trioxide. Veterinary grade. I analyzed 24 blood samples Richard provided over 6 months, plus hair samples showing 5 years of growth, 12 urine samples, and 6 coffee samples from his freezer. The dosage was 5 to 10 milligrams daily sublethal, but high enough to cause chronic symptoms mimicking dementia. The sample matches the coffee residue at 99.8% certainty. This is classic elder abuse via poisoning designed to establish incompetence for guardianship fraud. Marcus Whitmore's findings were devastating. She documented her own conspiracy, deleted emails between Sienna and Bradley. "He's getting weaker. Another 6 months and we can file for guardianship." I found a draft guardianship petition on her laptop from 6 months ago. Her browser history: how to prove someone has dementia. Emergency guardianship, California. Text messages between Sienna and her lover, Dominic. "Once I get control of the trust, we can travel anywhere." But Thomas Reed's presentation hit hardest. He opened Sophie's diary and read aloud. "Yanda, day 47. Mom poured the white powder again this morning. Grandpa's hands shook so bad he dropped his coffee cup. She smiled. I don't understand why she's happy when he's sick." Thomas looked up. 180 entries, 47 photographs, 4 video clips showing Sienna pouring powder into Richard's coffee. "I've worked elder abuse cases for 20 years. I've never seen evidence this compelling. A jury will weep." By 8:30 we had the full picture. Edward stood. "Now we set the trap." He laid out the plan with chess grandmaster precision. Phase 1, we let Sienna execute her conspiracy. Tomorrow she'll call Sophie and lie say Richard's having a medical emergency. Sophie will play along, but won't actually call Richard. Phase 2, we send a body double to the hospital. James Crawford, professional stage actor who looks enough like Richard. Dr. Keene will perform his fraudulent examination, write his fake report, and sign it. The moment he signs, FBI agents waiting in the next room will arrest him. By Phase 3, Sienna and Bradley arrive thinking their plan succeeded. The FBI arrests them. Richard appears with the evidence binders, 847 pages compiled. Every transaction, every lab result, every diary entry, every email. By Phase 4 emergency court hearing within 24 hours, we present everything: poisoning, embezzlement, guardianship fraud, conspiracy. The judge issues no bail detention. At 9 o'clock, I called Sophie on the burner phone. Tomorrow your mom might call and say I'm very sick. She'll ask you to call me and tell me to go to the hospital. Can you pretend to believe her but don't actually call me? I understand. You're setting a trap. You're so smart. I love you. I love you too, Grandpa. And I'm glad you're finally fighting back. She deserves this. My throat tightened. You saved my life, Sophie. I'll never forget that. At 10 o'clock, we left the building through the underground garage. Edward had chartered a Gulfstream through a shell company. 25 minutes later, I was touching down at Napa County Airport. Edward had a safe house there, a vineyard estate where I could prepare the final evidence binders without surveillance. By 11:30, I was on a secure video call with Edward. Everything's ready, he said. Evidence binders, 6 copies, 847 pages each. FBI briefed. Body double hired. Cameras installed at Bay Pacific Medical Center. We're 48 hours from checkmate. I looked out at the Napa Valley darkness. Sienna thought she was clever, I said. 5 years of invisible harm, offshore accounts, fake medical reports, but she forgot one thing. What's that? I'm a tech founder. I've spent 35 years thinking 3 moves ahead of my competitors. She was playing checkers. I was playing chess. In 72 hours, Sienna would walk into Bay Pacific Medical Center, believing she was about to seize control of my life. Instead, she'd step directly into a federal crime scene with FBI agents recording every word, Dr. Keene turning state's witness, and 847 pages of evidence waiting to bury her. The hospital trap was set. The morning of day 4 arrived with the kind of clarity that comes before a storm. Sienna believed she was setting a trap, but she had no idea she was walking into mine. I watched the sunrise from the second-floor window of Edward's Napa safe house, a glass of coffee in my hand. No arsenic, just Colombian dark roast, and waited for my phone to buzz. Sophie's text arrived at 9:17, saying Sienna had called exactly as predicted. She told her mother she'd help playing her role perfectly. 15 minutes earlier, Sophie had been sitting in her dorm room at Harrington Prep Academy when her phone rang. She'd taken a deep breath and answered with just the right amount of concern in her voice. Sienna's voice had been pitched perfectly worried and loving and desperate. Sophie, sweetheart, it's Grandpa Rick. He's very sick. He called me this morning. He was confused, having chest pains. I'm worried he's having a heart attack, but he won't go to the hospital. Sophie had let her voice tremble just enough. Oh no. Is he okay? The conversation had proceeded exactly as I'd predicted. Sienna asked Sophie to call me and convince me to go to Bay Pacific Medical Center where Dr. Keene would be waiting. Sophie had played along, perfectly pretending she didn't have my new number, promising she'd help when I called her. After the call ended, Sophie had whispered to herself, not knowing Edward had been recording from her phone's backup system. Sorry, Mom, but Grandpa Rick told me you'd lie. And he was right. My 11-year-old granddaughter was braver than most adults I knew. Later that morning, I listened through Edward's laptop as Sienna reported to Bradley in the Pacific Heights drawing room. The hidden microphones we'd planted 2 years ago were still functioning perfectly, capturing every word of her triumph. Sophie agreed, Sienna said. She'll call Richard when he contacts her. Bradley's voice was tense and skeptical. What if he doesn't contact her? Sienna sounded supremely confident. He will. He's obsessed with that kid. Give it 24 hours, he'll call her to check in. She'll tell him she's worried and he'll come running. She went on to explain that she'd transferred $75,000 that morning, selling the Monet from my study to a private collector who didn't ask questions. Dr. Keene would be at Bay Pacific Medical Center tomorrow at noon. The emergency guardianship petition was already filed with a hearing scheduled for 48 hours from now. She'd told the court I was a danger to myself, that I had dementia, and was refusing medical care. Police would be on standby for a 72-hour psychiatric hold once Dr. Keene signed the evaluation. Bradley sounded uncertain about the risk they were taking, but Sienna shut him down coldly. We're out of options. In 48 hours, either I control the trust, or we're both bankrupt and facing federal charges. There's no middle ground. I closed the laptop and looked out at the vineyards rolling away under morning sun. Sienna was selling my art to pay a corrupt doctor to destroy my life, and she thought she was winning. Edward arrived at 11:30 with James Crawford, the body double who would take my place at the hospital. Meeting James in person was unsettling. He was 65, 5'10", 170 pounds, close enough to my 5'11", 175, that most people wouldn't notice the difference. His hair was gray and receding in the same pattern as mine, and his face had the same angular features. What convinced me he was worth $25,000 was the way he moved. "You have a slight limp," James said, studying me. "Left knee." I blinked in surprise. "Old skiing injury, 1998. James walked across the room and returned with the same subtle hitch in his left leg that I'd been living with for 26 years. When I spoke a test sentence, he repeated it perfectly, with the same cadence and slight rasp I'd developed from years of speaking over conference room noise. Edward laid out the scenario for James. Tomorrow at noon, he'd arrive at Bay Pacific Medical Center, pretending to be me, confused and disoriented, complaining of chest pains. Dr. Keene would evaluate him, asking questions designed to make him seem incompetent. James would play along, giving confused answers, forgetting dates, seeming frail. The evaluation would last about 30 minutes, and the moment Dr. Keene signed the fraudulent medical report, FBI agents would arrest him. When Edward explained that Sienna had been poisoning me for 5 years and was trying to steal my estate through guardianship fraud, James looked at me for a long moment before speaking quietly. "Then I'm honored to help you, sir. I'll give the performance of my career." Agent Rebecca Foster joined us via video call at 2 o'clock from Edward's office in San Francisco. She was 42 with 18 years at the FBI specializing in elder abuse cases. She explained that 6 agents would be at Bay Pacific Medical Center tomorrow, with 2 hidden in the evaluation room, using cameras in ceiling tiles and audio in light fixtures. The moment Dr. Keene signed the fraudulent report, they'd move. They'd wait for Sienna and Bradley to arrive at the hospital, wanting them on site when arrests were made to strengthen the conspiracy case. By 4 o'clock, every piece was in position. Sophie was back at Harrington Prep doing homework. James Crawford was rehearsing in front of a mirror at the safe house. Agent Foster and her team were finalizing surveillance positions. Dr. Keene was printing his fraudulent report, confident that $75,000 was worth the risk. And Sienna was sitting in the Pacific Heights mansion, drinking wine, telling Bradley that by tomorrow she'd have control of my life. I stood at the window, watching the sun sink toward the Pacific, thinking about the first time I'd held Sienna as a 3-year-old child after my sister died. I'd promised her I'd never let anything hurt her, and I'd kept that promise for 32 years. Tomorrow I'd break it, because the hospital wouldn't be a trap for me. It would be a crime scene for her. The silver Tesla Model S pulled into Bay Pacific Medical Center's emergency entrance at 11:47 on the morning of Day 5, and the man who stepped out looked exactly like me, sounded exactly like me, and was about to become the star witness in a federal crime. I watched it happen through Edward's laptop from his office 42 floors above San Francisco's financial district. The video feed came from Agent Foster's surveillance van parked across from the hospital, and the image quality was sharp enough that I could see James Crawford's face as he climbed out wearing my navy sweater and gray slacks. He even had the limp right, that slight hitch in his left knee from my skiing accident in 1998. Edward murmured beside me that James was perfect, and I reminded him we were paying $25,000 for that perfection. A hospital volunteer approached James at the entrance, asking if she could help. Through the audio feed, I heard James let confusion cloud his voice as he explained he was supposed to see Dr. Keene, that his daughter said he needed to be here. The volunteer directed him to the third-floor evaluation room 3B, and James limped toward the elevator with every movement matching mine perfectly. By 11:55, James had reached the third floor where a nurse appeared. Agent Linda Hayes was 38, undercover FBI, wearing scrubs and a name tag that identified her as Linda R.N. She greeted James professionally and led him into evaluation room 3B with perfect concern for his confused state. The moment the door closed, Edward's laptop screen split into 5 video feeds. Camera 1 was mounted in the smoke detector on the ceiling, giving a wide-angle view of the entire room. Camera 2 was hidden in the wall clock above the examination table, capturing close-ups of faces. Camera 3 was positioned in the blood pressure machine, angled to catch both men's expressions. Camera 4 was concealed in a tissue box on Dr. Keene's desk for a side view, and Camera 5 was a pen camera Agent Hayes had positioned on a shelf before leaving, capturing the doorway. Agent Foster's voice came through the laptop speaker, confirming they had 5 angles with audio from 3 sources recording everything in 4K resolution. Marcus's keylogger was active, ready to capture every keystroke once Dr. Keene started typing his report. Dr. Keene entered the room at noon, exactly looking nervous, with a smile too wide and a handshake too firm. He was a man about to commit a federal crime for $75,000, and some part of him knew it was wrong. He pulled up a chair across from James and began the evaluation with basic questions. James played his role flawlessly, showing confusion about the date and year, unable to remember the hospital's name, trailing off when asked about what Vanguard systems made. Every answer was carefully calibrated to suggest severe cognitive impairment while staying believable. When Dr. Keene asked the key question about managing finances, James delivered the perfect response, saying Sienna handled everything because she was very smart and took care of all the accounts. Dr. Keene wrote furiously, building his fraudulent case with each confused answer James provided. The evaluation lasted 23 minutes. In that time, Dr. Keene had documented enough fabricated evidence to have me declared incompetent and strip me of every legal right I possessed. Except the man he'd evaluated wasn't me. At 12:25, Dr. Keene moved to a private office and opened his laptop. Through Marcus Whitmore's keylogger, we watched him type his fraudulent report in real time. The psychiatric evaluation was comprehensive and damning, stating I was disoriented to time and place, had severe memory impairment, poor insight and judgment, and was unable to manage my own finances. His diagnosis was major neurocognitive disorder, moderate to severe, with an immediate recommendation for emergency guardianship and a 72-hour psychiatric hold because I was a danger to myself. He printed the document, reviewed it, and picked up his pen. At 1:15, Sienna and Bradley walked into the hospital lobby. I watched them through the entrance camera, seeing Sienna's triumphant, cold smile as she told Bradley that Dr. Keene had texted confirming the evaluation was done. She explained that I had shown up confused and disoriented, unable to remember basic facts, and the report was ready for them to pick up and file with the court. By tonight, she said she'd have guardianship. They walked toward the elevator, and I could hear Sienna continuing her victory speech. By tomorrow, the trust would be hers, the company would be hers, everything would be hers. When Bradley asked about me, she explained the 72-hour psychiatric hold with casual cruelty, saying that by the time I got out, the court order would be final and I'd be powerless. The elevator doors closed as they rode up to the third floor. Edward looked at me and said that Sienna had just entered the building and Dr. Keene was about to sign. I kept my eyes on the screen watching Dr. Keene's hand hover over the signature line and told Edward to let him sign. The moment his pen touched that paper, it would be a federal crime. And when Sienna walked into that room, she'd become a co-conspirator. Edward's voice was quiet as he asked if I was ready for this, reminding me that once the FBI moved, there would be no going back, and Sienna would go to prison. I thought about 5 years of arsenic poisoning, about $12 million stolen, about an 11-year-old girl who'd spent 6 months documenting her mother's crimes because no one else would believe her. I told Edward that Sienna had poisoned me for 5 years, that she was ready for prison, and I was ready to watch. On the laptop screen, the clock ticked toward 1:30. Dr. Keene leaned forward, the fraudulent report spread in front of him, and reached for his pen. In the adjacent room, Agent Foster's hand moved to her radio. In the elevator, Sienna and Bradley rose toward the third floor, seconds away from what they believed would be their victory. The pen touched paper. Edward's laptop screen flickered once. Agent Foster's voice crackled through the speaker with 2 words, "Signature confirmed." Then everything went silent. Before I reveal what happens when those hospital doors open, I need to know you're still with me. Comment below and tell me on a scale of 1 to 10, how curious are you about what Richard does next? I want to see those numbers. Also, a quick note. The story ahead contains some dramatized elements that may not reflect actual events. If you'd prefer not to continue, feel free to pause here. The silence lasted 3 seconds after Agent Foster's voice crackled through Edward's laptop, confirming the signature. Then the door to room 3C burst open, and 6 FBI agents flooded in, with weapons drawn and badges raised. Dr. Keene dropped his pen and stood so fast, his chair toppled backward, his face going white as his hands came up in automatic surrender. I watched it happen through Edward's laptop from the hospital parking garage, where we'd been waiting for the past hour. The camera feed showed Agent Foster stepping forward with her badge, identifying herself and announcing Dr. Keene was under arrest for medical fraud conspiracy to commit elder abuse and falsification of medical documents. Before she even finished reading his rights, Dr. Keene was already trying to save himself by shouting that Sienna Sterling had hired him and paid him $75,000. Agent Foster's expression didn't change as she informed him they had recorded everything and he'd just become a witness in a federal case. When Dr. Keene asked if the old man he'd evaluated was really Richard Sterling, she told him no, it was an actor, and the real Richard Sterling was very much competent and waiting to press charges. Edward closed the laptop and told me that Sienna's elevator should be arriving on the 3rd floor right about now. We took the stairs 3 flights up, moving fast but quiet. And by the time we reached the 3rd floor corridor, Sienna and Bradley were stepping out of the elevator with smiles on their faces and confidence in their walk. Sienna was saying something to Bradley about picking up the report when she saw the FBI agents in the hallway and froze mid-sentence. Agent Foster stepped forward with her badge raised and announced that Sienna Sterling was under arrest for conspiracy to commit guardianship fraud, elder abuse embezzlement, and wire fraud. Sienna laughed nervously, trying to insist this was insane, and she was just here to pick up her father's medical evaluation. Agent Foster cut through her denial with cold precision, explaining that her father was not here, that the man Dr. Keene evaluated was an actor named James Crawford, and they had video and audio recordings of her hiring Dr. Keene to write a fraudulent report for $75,000. The color drained from Sienna's face as Agent Foster turned to Bradley and arrested him for embezzlement, wire fraud, and accessory to elder abuse. Bradley backed away, protesting that he didn't do anything, that it was all Sienna, but Agent Miller had him in handcuffs before he could retreat another step. Sienna was shouting now, as Agent Foster cuffed her, demanding to see her father and insisting he was sick and needed her. That's when I stepped out from the alcove where I'd been waiting with Edward and the attorneys. My voice was calm and cold and empty of everything except the weight of what she'd done as I told her I was right here and not sick at all, that I'd never been more clear-headed in my life. She turned and saw me, and her mouth fell open, unable to process what she was seeing. I was wearing a tailored navy suit that fit perfectly because I'd gained back 15 pounds since I stopped drinking poisoned coffee. My hands were steady with no tremors. My hair was full and gray instead of thin and patchy, and I stood straight with no confusion in my eyes. I stepped closer and told her I was healthy because 6 months off, arsenic would do that. When she whispered the word arsenic like it was foreign, I explained with clinical precision how she'd been putting it in my coffee every morning for 5 years, just enough to make me seem confused and frail and incompetent, so she could set up guardianship fraud. She tried to deny it, but I cut through her lies. Sophie had documented everything I told her. 180 diary entries, photographs, videos. Dr. Bennett's toxicology report would be entered into evidence, and the FBI had recordings of her conspiring with Bradley and Dr. Keene in the drawing room where I'd installed microphones 2 years ago. Tears started down her cheeks as she tried to call me Dad, but I told her not to use that word because I wasn't her father biologically or legally. Edward would be handing Agent Foster a sealed envelope containing DNA evidence from 15 years ago, and when they opened it, she'd learned she had 0 inheritance rights under the Sterling family trust. Agent Foster pulled out a tablet and played the recordings. Sienna's own voice filled the corridor, conspiring to declare me incompetent, hiring Dr. Keene for cash planning to use Sophie as bait. When the recording ended, Agent Foster explained that combined with the evidence we'd compiled over 6 months, Sienna was looking at 15 to 20 years in federal prison. Sienna was sobbing now, begging to give everything back, but I told her there was nothing left to give because the offshore accounts were frozen and the trust had been revoked. The agents began leading them toward the elevator, and Sienna turned back with her face streaked with tears, asking why I was doing this after everything she'd done for Vanguard and for me. My answer was simple and brutal. She had spent 5 years trying to destroy me from the inside out, stolen millions, tried to take Sophie's future, and used her own daughter as bait. That wasn't love, I told her. That was betrayal in its purest form. The elevator doors closed on her sobbing face, and the corridor fell silent. Edward's hand settled on my shoulder, saying it was over, but I corrected him. Now it begins, I said. Now, by 3:30 that afternoon, Sienna Sterling was no longer the chief operating officer of a $350 million company. She was inmate number SF20248847, fingerprinted and photographed, and facing 15 years in a federal prison cell. The FBI van pulled away from Bay Pacific Medical Center at 3:15, with Sienna Bradley and Dr. Keene secured in separate compartments. Through the reinforced glass partition, I could see Sienna sitting alone in the rear section, her hands cuffed in front of her, mascara running down her face in black streaks that stained the collar of her $8,000 Dior dress. She was whispering the same words over and over, and I could read her lips even through the glass. This can't be happening. This can't be real. In the middle compartment, Bradley was shouting at the agents, demanding his lawyer, insisting he didn't poison anyone, and blaming everything on Sienna. Dr. Keene sat in the front compartment with his head in his hands, silent and resigned, knowing his medical career was over and the $75,000 that had seemed like salvation 6 hours ago was now the worst decision of his life. Edward and I followed in a separate car without speaking. There was nothing left to say that hadn't already been said in a hospital corridor an hour ago. By the time the FBI van arrived at the San Francisco Federal Building on 450 Golden Gate Avenue, the media was already assembled. 12 news vans lined the street with 30 reporters jostling for position behind police barriers, while 50 onlookers recorded everything on smartphones. The moment the van's rear doors opened, the shouting began with questions about poisoning and guilt, and stolen money echoing across the plaza. The booking process began at 4 o'clock in the basement processing center. Agent Foster read Sienna her rights again, then recited the charges in a flat, professional voice. The specifics matched what had been documented in her arrest at the hospital. An hour earlier, elder abuse wire fraud, embezzlement conspiracy. Total potential sentence, 15 to 20 years in federal prison. They took her fingerprints on an electronic scanner, then the photographs with unforgiving flash that captured her looking exactly like what she'd become, a criminal hollow-eyed and broken. They confiscated her personal property with clinical precision. The Cartier necklace worth $45,000 seized as potential proceeds of crime. Her iPhone seized for evidence. The wallet containing $3,200 in cash from the art sale seized. When Sienna asked if she could call Sophie, Agent Foster told her that Sophie was safe with Edward Morrison and his wife, that she'd been informed of the arrest, and Sienna should use her one phone call for an attorney. That's when Sienna broke down, crying, her whole body shaking with sobs that echoed off the concrete walls. They processed Bradley next, with charges totaling 12 to 18 years for wire fraud, embezzlement, accessory to elder abuse and conspiracy. He tried to cut a deal immediately, offering to testify against Sienna and claiming he was just following orders. Dr. Keene's charges came last with 8 to 12 years for medical fraud, conspiracy to commit elder abuse, and false statements in healthcare matters, plus permanent loss of his medical license. At 5:30, I stood at a podium outside the federal building with Edward on my left and attorney Jennifer Hayes on my right. 30 cameras pointed at me as I read from the prepared statement we'd written that morning, my voice calm and controlled and empty of emotion. I explained that Sienna had poisoned me with arsenic for 5 years to make me appear incompetent, that she and Bradley had stolen $20 million total, that they'd hired a corrupt physician to write a fake medical report, and that they'd used my 11-year-old granddaughter Sophie as bait in their scheme. I called Sophie the real hero who documented her mother's crimes for 6 months because she loved me and wanted to protect me. I ended by saying justice would be served and walked away as reporters shouted after me, not looking back. By 6 o'clock, Sophie was sitting in the guest bedroom of Edward's home in Pacific Heights, with Margaret Morrison, Edward's wife of 38 years. Margaret sat on the bed beside Sophie with one arm around the girl's shoulders, gently explaining that her mother was really going to prison for doing very bad things. But none of it was Sophie's fault. When Sophie asked when she could see me, Margaret promised I'd be there for breakfast after handling some legal things tonight. By 7 o'clock, the media storm had exploded across every platform. CNN ran breaking news about the tech heiress arrested for poisoning her billionaire father with arsenic over 5 years. Within 2 hours, the trending topics on social media included Sienna Sterling, with 482,000 posts, Vanguard poison, with 201,000, elder abuse with 178,000, and justice for Richard, with 156,000 mentions across platforms. The reactions were merciless, calling Sienna a sociopath and praising Sophie as a hero while demanding life in prison for the poisoner. At 8 o'clock, I stood at the window of my penthouse suite at the Grand Pacific Hotel, watching the city lights spread across the bay like scattered diamonds. Edward entered with 2 glasses of scotch and told me the prosecutors wanted to meet tomorrow morning to offer Sienna a plea deal of 15 years if she pleaded guilty to all charges. When he asked what would happen if she refused, I told him she'd face trial and get 20+ years with the evidence we had. I told Edward to let her choose because I was done choosing for her. Edward mentioned one more thing: tomorrow we'd present the DNA evidence. I thought about the envelope in Edward's safe containing the test I'd ordered 15 years ago when Sienna was 20, and I'd needed to update the trust documents. The results had sat sealed in that envelope ever since, waiting for the moment when the truth would matter more than the lie I'd been living. I told Edward I'd been ready for 15 years. By 8 o'clock that evening, Sienna's mugshot was circulating on every news channel showing inmate number SF202488847 with hollow eyes and running mascara. The media had the poisoning story, the embezzlement figures, the corrupt doctor, and the 11-year-old hero. But they didn't have the final twist, the DNA test, that would prove Sienna had never been my daughter at all. Tomorrow in federal court, that truth would destroy the last shred of identity she had left. And I would watch knowing that sometimes justice requires not just punishment, but the complete dismantling of a lie. The evening settled over the San Francisco Federal Building, with a weight that felt like the final act of a play rehearsed for years. Edward and I sat in the observation room on the 4th floor, watching 3 separate interrogation feeds displayed on a wall-mounted monitor array. The screens glowed with cold, fluorescent light, each frame showing a different room, a different suspect, and a different calculation of survival. Room 1 held Dr. Martin Keene slumped in a metal chair with his public defender, Robert Hayes, beside him. Room 2 contained Bradley Vaughn sitting upright with his attorney, Catherine Walsh, whispering urgently in his ear. Room 3 framed Sienna silent and pale, flanked by her high-priced attorney, Diana Blackwood. Edward leaned back and crossed his arms, explaining that Agent Foster would ask them all the same question tonight, about how much they wanted to save themselves. The order they answered would determine who spent the next 2 decades in federal prison. I watched the screens without blinking, thinking about 5 years of poisoning, 12 million in embezzlement, and a fraudulent guardianship scheme designed to erase me from my own life. The evidence filled 847 pages, and every word was ironclad. Tonight was not about mercy, but about watching the architecture of their conspiracy collapse under the weight of their own choices. At 8:30 in the evening, Agent Rebecca Foster entered Room 1 with Agent Miller close behind. Dr. Keene looked up with the hollow eyes of a man who had already lost. Foster placed a thick evidence folder on the table and opened it, slowly revealing 5 still frames from the hospital surveillance footage showing Keene writing notes, asking questions, and signing the fraudulent psychiatric evaluation. Foster's voice was calm and precise as she recited the charges and the evidence against him. Robert Hayes, the public defender, leaned forward, saying his client was willing to cooperate fully in exchange for a sentencing recommendation. Keene's voice cracked as he explained that Sienna told him it was just paperwork, that her father needed help and was dangerous to himself. He needed the money desperately, with his license already suspended twice and $200,000 in debt. Foster slid a voice recorder across the table and told him to start from the beginning. By 9:15, Keene had confessed to everything: the initial meeting at a cafe in the Marina District, 2 weeks earlier, the cash payment delivered in a manila envelope, the specific wording Sienna had dictated for the evaluation, and the promise that no one would ever check the medical records because the guardianship would be approved quickly. Foster explained that if he testified against Sienna Sterling and Bradley Vaughn, the prosecutor would recommend 8 to 10 years, but if he refused, he'd face 15 to 18. Keene nodded through his tears and agreed to testify about everything. Edward tapped the screen showing Room 1 and noted that the first one was down with Keene lasting less than an hour. On the second monitor, Agent Foster and Agent Miller were already entering Room 2, where Bradley Vaughn sat with practiced confidence. Foster opened a second evidence folder detailing the $8 million he'd transferred to shell companies in the Cayman Islands over 3 years, using fake contracts and false invoices. Walsh cleared her throat, saying her client was prepared to cooperate fully in exchange for immunity, but Miller shook his head firmly. Immunity was off the table for someone who'd embezzled $8 million and conspired to poison and institutionalize a man for financial gain. The best deal available was a sentencing recommendation in exchange for full testimony against Sienna Sterling. Bradley's confidence wavered as he insisted that Sienna planned everything and told him Richard was mentally unstable and would destroy the company. He swore he didn't know about the arsenic, but Foster leaned back and pointed out that he didn't ask questions because he was making millions. Miller slid a document across the table offering full cooperation and complete testimony about every transaction in exchange for 10 years instead of 15 to 18. Bradley stared at the document for a long moment, then picked up a pen and agreed to take it. Edward checked his watch and noted that Bradley folded in less than 30 minutes. The third monitor showed Agent Foster and Agent Miller entering room 3, where Sienna sat perfectly still with her hands folded on the table and her expression carved from ice. Foster placed the largest evidence folder on the table and recited the 847 pages of evidence documenting her crimes: 12 million in embezzlement, 5 years of poisoning with arsenic trioxide conspiracy to fabricate a fraudulent psychiatric evaluation, plus bank records, toxicology reports, audio recordings, video footage, and Sophie's 180-page diary. Diana Blackwood held up a hand, declaring that her client would not be making any statements tonight. Miller opened the folder and spread documents across the table explaining that Dr. Keene had already confessed and agreed to testify. Bradley Vaughn had agreed to full cooperation, and Sienna was facing 15 to 20 years. She had 24 hours to accept a plea offer of 15 years, or they'd go to trial and ask for the maximum. Sienna's eyes remained fixed on the wall as Blackwood whispered something inaudible, then told the agents they'd review the evidence and provide a response within the 24-hour window. Foster stood and reminded Sienna to think about 15 to 20 years and what Sophie would remember when she was 30 and her mother was still behind bars. Sienna said nothing. Edward muted the monitor feeds and turned to me, summarizing that Keene flipped within 2 hours. Bradley negotiated a deal by midnight, but Sienna was staying silent. I nodded slowly and said her silence wouldn't save her, because the evidence was overwhelming. Edward opened his briefcase and pulled out a sealed envelope, noting that tomorrow we'd introduce the DNA evidence proving 32 years of lies about being my daughter when she was never my child at all. I looked at the envelope, then back at the screens showing 3 people who had tried to erase me from my own life, now facing the consequences of their choices. I told Edward to let them sleep on it, because tomorrow the truth would come out, and when the DNA results were read in open court, the world would know exactly who Sienna Sterling really was. Dominic was scrolling through social media on the leather couch when his phone buzzed with a notification that changed everything. The CNN alert flashed across the screen sometime after noon on the 6th day, with a headline that made his stomach twist. Breaking: Silicon Valley heiress Sienna Sterling arrested for poisoning. Billionaire father with arsenic. Facing 15 to 20 years federal prison. $20 million embezzlement charges. He read the article twice, his thumb moving slower with each swipe. There was Sienna's mugshot with mascara streaking down her cheeks, hair-tangled eyes empty. The details were worse than he'd imagined. 5 years of poisoning, 12 million in embezzlement offshore accounts, frozen by the FBI, and a press conference where Richard Sterling had stood calmly beside his attorney, explaining how his daughter had tried to erase him. Dominic set the phone down and stared at the exposed brick wall of the Marina District apartment, the one Sienna paid $4,500 a month to keep. Everything in this place belonged to her, and he'd never actually built a life of his own. His hands moved without thinking, opening the banking app to check the account Sienna labeled Household Expenses. The balance had been $125,000 last time he checked, but the screen now showed 0 with red letters beneath it. Account frozen per federal investigation. His personal checking showed $3,400, barely enough to cover rent for 1 month, and the lease was in Sienna's name anyway. He had no income. His title as wellness coach being a polite fiction to avoid admitting he lived off a woman who paid for everything because she liked how he looked in Tom Ford suits at charity galas. The duffel bag came out of the closet within the hour, and he packed with the efficiency of someone who'd done this before. Clothes Sienna had bought him all designer labels that would sell well if he needed cash. His laptop passport and the $3,400 in cash he'd withdrawn on the walk back from the ATM. He left the furniture because none of it was his, left the lease because it was her problem now, and left no forwarding address because there was nothing here worth coming back to. Before calling the Uber, he opened his phone one last time and blocked Sienna's number on all 3 phones she rotated through. He deleted 2 years of text messages, 47 photos of vacations and dinners and hotel rooms, every social media tag that linked them together. His relationship status went blank. His location disappeared, and then he requested a ride to the airport. The ticket counter at SFO offered a one-way flight to Miami for $380, departing in less than 2 hours. Dominic bought it and sent a text to an ex-girlfriend while walking toward the gate asking if he could crash with her for a few days. She replied quickly, asking what happened, and he told her he'd explain when he arrived. He wouldn't explain, he'd lie the way he always did, and by the time she figured it out, he'd already be on to someone new. Sienna sat in a holding cell in the San Francisco County Jail wearing an orange jumpsuit and no makeup. Her hair unwashed and her face hollow from 24 hours without sleep. The walls were concrete, the air thick with disinfectant, and the metallic scent of fear. Diana Blackwood arrived in the visitor room with a leather portfolio and the kind of expression that promised bad news. She sat across the metal table and delivered it with professional precision. Dominic was gone. He'd emptied the Marina apartment, blocked Sienna's number, and flew to Miami that afternoon on a one-way ticket. Sienna's breath caught as she insisted he wouldn't leave, because they were supposed to travel together once she got the money back. Diana didn't flinch, as she explained there was no money. The accounts were frozen, the father had revoked the trust, and Dominic wasn't waiting 15 years for someone facing federal prison. When Sienna protested that he said he loved her, Diana's response was simple and brutal. He loved your money. I'm sorry. The realization came in waves, each one heavier than the last. In 5 days, Sienna had lost $42 million, her title as COO, her freedom, her father who disowned her in front of cameras, her daughter who refused to visit after spending 6 months collecting evidence, and now Dominic who vanished the moment the money disappeared with no goodbye, just a blocked number and a boarding pass to Miami. When Sienna asked if she could see Sophie, Diana explained that Sophie didn't want to see her because she felt traumatized by what she documented. When Sienna learned that Sophie had helped the FBI arrest her with 180 diary entries, 47 photos, and 4 videos, her head dropped to the table, and the sobs came in gasps. Diana's voice softened, but didn't waver as she pointed out that Sophie loved her grandfather more than she feared her mother, and Sienna should think about what that meant. Sienna found a scrap of paper later that afternoon and wrote a desperate note begging Dominic to call her, promising she could fix everything and would be out in 10 years if he'd just wait for her. 3 days later, the note came back with a red stamp across the envelope, "Return to sender, address unknown." Sienna never heard from Dominic again. She had spent 5 years poisoning the one person who had ever loved her unconditionally, so she could afford to keep a man who only loved her money. When that money vanished, so did he, leaving nothing behind but a blocked number and a one-way ticket. Sitting in a jail cell surrounded by concrete walls and the weight of every choice she'd made, Sienna finally understood what her father had tried to teach her at the Apex on that final night. Real value isn't always obvious, and sometimes the things that seem ordinary turn out to be the most precious, by the time you understand that it's already too late to get them back. Edward's team walked into the U.S. Attorney's office on the 11th floor of the San Francisco Federal Building, carrying 6 identical briefcases, each one holding 847 pages of evidence that would take prosecutors 4 hours to review and only 3 minutes to decide. This was the most documented elder abuse case in federal history. The conference room was large and sterile, with a long table, overhead projector screens, and windows overlooking the city. Michael Porter, the U.S. attorney, sat at the head of the table with Sarah Crawford, the assistant U.S. attorney who would handle the prosecution, while Agent Rebecca Foster from the FBI sat to their right with her notepad already open. I took a seat near the back, while Edward stood at the head of the table and placed his briefcase down with a quiet thud that seemed to echo. He looked at Porter and Crawford with the calm confidence of someone who had spent months preparing for this moment, explaining they were here to present comprehensive evidence involving 5 years of elder abuse through arsenic poisoning, $20 million in combined embezzlement, guardianship fraud, and conspiracy. Michael Porter leaned back in his chair with the kind of face that had seen every variation of human cruelty, asking what they were presenting today. Edward opened the first briefcase and began stacking binders on the table, explaining they had 847 pages of evidence across 4 categories: forensic accounting, toxicology, digital forensics, and victim documentation. Jennifer Hayes was the first to stand, a forensic accountant, formerly with the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. Financial charts appeared on the screen behind her as she explained her comprehensive audit documenting systematic embezzlement totaling $12 million by Sienna Sterling and an additional $8 million by Bradley Vaughn. She explained the forensic trail showed systematic embezzlement across 3 methods totaling $12 million, all documented in the evidence binders with wire transfer receipts, shell company registrations, and forged board resolutions. Every transaction was traceable, she told them, and the paper trail was complete. Dr. Sarah Bennett stood next to a toxicologist from Stanford Medical School, who brought up medical charts showing blood test results, hair samples, and coffee analysis. She confirmed chronic arsenic exposure over 5 years, consistent with the timeline Sophie documented. The medical analysis showed the dosage was calculated to create symptoms of cognitive decline, not to kill, establishing a clear pattern of incapacitation for control. She showed side-by-side photos of me from 2019 looking healthy, 2023 showing visible decline, and 2024 after 6 months off arsenic showing recovery. When Porter asked if this was attempted murder, Dr. Bennett said no, this was attempted incapacitation, because if Sienna wanted me dead, she would have used a lethal dose. She wanted me alive, but incompetent, so she could control me and my fortune, which Porter acknowledged was even more sinister. Marcus Whitmore was next, a cybersecurity specialist who had worked for the NSA before going private. He recovered deleted files from Sienna's and Bradley's devices showing emails documenting premeditation and conspiracy, including one from Sienna saying the arsenic was working and they could file for guardianship in 6 months, another from Bradley about transferring offshore funds, and one to Dominic, promising they could travel anywhere once she got control of the trust. Browser history and draft documents recovered from her devices proved premeditation, with guardianship petitions written months before any medical evaluation was obtained. Thomas Reed stood last, a private investigator and former FBI agent who placed a leather-bound diary on the table. The room went silent as he explained this was Sophie Sterling's diary, documenting 6 months of her mother's crimes because she loved her grandfather and wanted to save his life. He read entries showing Sophie's observations of her mother pouring white powder into my coffee, her research discovering it was arsenic for livestock, her decision to show me the diary, and her final entry saying she loved me more than she was scared of her mother. The diary's detailed documentation over 6 months built a federal case because no one else was protecting her grandfather. Sarah Crawford wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, while Michael Porter sat back in his chair saying that in 30 years as a prosecutor, he'd never seen anything like this. Agent Foster played audio recordings of Sienna hiring Dr. Keene for $75,000 to write a fraudulent report and planning to use Sophie as bait, which sealed the case completely. When the recordings finished, Sarah Crawford closed her binder and told Michael Porter this was the strongest elder abuse case she'd ever seen, with 99% conviction probability and recommended sentence of 15 to 20 years federal prison for Sienna Sterling. Porter didn't hesitate, agreeing to offer a plea deal of 15 years with no parole and full restitution of $12 million. And if she refused, they'd go to trial seeking 20 to 25 years. Bradley would get 10 to 12 years with cooperation, and Dr. Keene would get 5 to 8 with full testimony. Porter turned to Edward with an expression that was hard but respectful, telling him to convey to his client that this was justice and they would prosecute this case to the fullest extent of federal law. The meeting ended just after 6 o'clock in the evening, and as we packed the briefcases and prepared to leave, I thought about the envelope still sealed in Edward's briefcase containing the DNA test that would prove Sienna had never been my daughter at all. Tomorrow in federal court. That envelope would be opened, and when it was, Sienna wouldn't just lose her freedom, but her identity, her inheritance, and the last shred of the lie she'd been living for 32 years. The doors of courtroom 4B in the San Francisco Federal Courthouse opened just before 9 o'clock on the 7th morning, and the gallery filled with more than 100 people within minutes. Journalists sat shoulder to shoulder in the back rows, while family members, legal observers, and members of the public, who had been following the case, packed every available seat. The courtroom itself was wood-paneled and solemn, with an American flag standing beside the bench and the seal of the Northern District of California mounted on the wall. Edward sat beside me in the front row with his briefcase resting on his lap, containing the sealed DNA envelope inside. We were here for an emergency bail hearing, but everyone in the room understood this was something more. The bailiff stood and raised his voice above the murmur of the crowd, announcing that the United States District Court for the Northern District of California was now in session with the Honorable Judge Patricia Holloway presiding. Judge Holloway entered from the side door in her black robe, a 62-year-old woman with gray hair and sharp eyes that had seen 20 years of federal cases. She took her seat and gestured for the rest of us to sit, announcing we were here for an emergency bail hearing in the matter of United States versus Sienna Sterling, Bradley Vaughn, and Martin Keene, with charges including elder abuse, wire fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. Sarah Crawford stood at the prosecution table explaining that the United States opposed bail for all three defendants because the charges were severe, the evidence was overwhelming, and the defendants posed a flight risk given the financial resources they allegedly embezzled. Diana Blackwood rose smoothly to request reasonable bail for her client Sienna Sterling, who had no prior criminal record, strong ties to the community, and a minor child who needed her. Judge Holloway said she'd hear testimony before ruling and instructed Crawford to call her first witness. Sarah Crawford called me to the stand, and I walked forward feeling the weight of every eye in the courtroom. After stating my name for the record, I explained that I had raised Sienna from the age of 3 after my sister Eleanor died in a car accident in 1992, that I'd legally changed Sienna's last name to Sterling and raised her as my own daughter for 32 years, and that I'd founded Vanguard Systems in 1985 and served as CEO until 5 years ago when I appointed Sienna as Chief Operating Officer. I described how 5 years ago, Sienna suggested I move into the guest house on our Pacific Heights estate, saying it would be better for my health, and how every morning at 7:30 she would bring me coffee that she insisted on making herself. For 5 years I drank that coffee and slowly became weaker with fatigue, confusion, and tremors in my hands, while doctors told me it was aging. 6 months ago, I had my blood tested privately, and the results showed chronic arsenic poisoning, which led me to stop drinking the coffee and start collecting evidence. I sent samples to Dr. Sarah Bennett at Stanford, and every test confirmed arsenic. And then my granddaughter Sophie came to me with a diary documenting her mother poisoning me every single morning for 6 months. I explained that Sienna poisoned me to make me appear incompetent, so she could file for guardianship and seize control of my estate worth approximately $585 million, that she embezzled $12 million over 5 years, while Bradley Vaughn stole another $8 million. And when I froze their accounts, they hired a corrupt doctor to write a fake medical report declaring me mentally unfit while using my 11-year-old granddaughter as bait to lure me into a trap. Diana Blackwood attempted to suggest, during cross-examination, that my decision to freeze Sienna's accounts was motivated by business disagreements rather than alleged poisoning. But I replied evenly that it was motivated by 5 years of arsenic in my bloodstream and 180 pages of my granddaughter's diary documenting the crime. Sarah Crawford then called Sophie Sterling to the stand, and the courtroom went silent as Sophie walked forward, wearing her Harrington prep uniform and clutching her leather-bound diary in both hands. Her voice came out soft but clear as she stated her name and identified Sienna as her mom and me as her grandpa Rick, her favorite person in the world. Sophie described with shaking but steady voice how 6 months ago she woke up early for a school project and saw her mom in the kitchen making my coffee, looking around to make sure no one was watching before taking a little bottle from her pocket and pouring white powder into the coffee. She explained that she was scared and didn't know what the powder was, but knew it was bad because her mom was hiding it. So she looked in the drawer where her mom kept the bottle and saw it said, "For livestock use only." She started writing everything down in her diary every morning, documenting the time, which was always 7:30 when I looked sick, taking pictures and recording videos on her phone when her mom didn't see her. When Crawford asked why she did this, Sophie's tears spilled over as she said she loved me and knew her mom was hurting me and didn't want me to die. She explained that after 3 months, she told me and showed me her diary, thinking I'd be mad at her for spying. But I hugged her and said she was brave and asked her to keep documenting everything because we needed evidence to stop her mom. Sophie then read from her diary with trembling hands and cracking voice, describing the moment she showed me her documentation, and I told her she was the bravest person I knew. The silence in the courtroom was absolute, with tears on the faces of journalists, observers, and even the bailiff as Judge Holloway thanked Sophie for her courage. Dr. Martin Keene was called next, and his testimony was brief and defeated, admitting that Sienna had hired him to write a fraudulent medical evaluation for $75,000 in cash, with instructions to document severe dementia regardless of what he observed, and that he knew it was fraud when he agreed. When the testimony concluded, Judge Holloway removed her glasses and looked at the defendants, saying that in 20 years presiding over this court, she had never seen a case quite like this, where an 11-year-old child spent 6 months documenting her mother's crimes because she loved her grandfather and wanted to save his life. She declared that Sienna had poisoned her father for 5 years, embezzled $12 million, conspired to defraud him of his freedom through a fake medical evaluation, and used her own daughter as bait in that conspiracy. The evidence was overwhelming. The charges were severe and bail was denied for all 3 defendants, who would remain in federal custody pending trial in 90 days. The gavel struck and echoed through the courtroom like a final judgment. Sienna turned in her seat and looked back at Sophie with eyes searching for something, but Sophie held my hand and didn't look away. In that moment, Sienna's face crumpled as she realized she had lost everything: her freedom, her fortune, her father, and her daughter. But there was one more loss coming, because tomorrow Edward would present the DNA envelope, proving that for 32 years, Sienna had been living a lie about who she was, and the name Sterling had never truly been hers. The lunch recess ended just after 2 o'clock, and the courtroom began filling again with the same crowd that had watched Sophie testify that morning. Edward sat beside me with his briefcase open on his lap, and I could see the sealed manila envelope resting on top of the other documents. It had been locked in his office safe for 15 years, and in the next hour it would erase Sienna's identity in the time it took to read 3 paragraphs of laboratory results. Judge Holloway returned to the bench and asked Edward to proceed with the additional evidence relevant to the trust asset dispute. Edward stood and held up the envelope so the judge could see the seal was intact, explaining he was presenting DNA test results that fundamentally altered the legal standing of Sienna Sterling's claim to Richard Sterling's estate. Results obtained 15 years ago and sealed in his office safe since that time. Diana Blackwood shot to her feet, protesting that this was highly irregular. But when Edward explained the nature was DNA paternity testing, proving that Sienna Sterling was not the biological daughter of Richard Sterling, the courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. Sienna stood so fast, her chair scraped backward as she shouted that this was insane because I was her father, but Judge Holloway's gavel came down hard, ordering her to sit down. Edward broke the seal on the envelope and removed a laboratory report, then connected his laptop to the courtroom projector. The document appeared on screen, showing GeneTech Laboratories' DNA paternity test report, dated March 15, 2009, 15 years ago. Edward read aloud the results section, stating that Richard Harrison Sterling was excluded as the biological father of Sienna Madison Sterling, with probability of paternity at 0%. Though additional analysis showed Sienna shared 25% genetic similarity with Richard, consistent with a niece-uncle relationship. Edward explained that Sienna was his niece because his late sister Eleanor Sterling was Sienna's biological mother, but Eleanor had an extramarital affair, and Sienna's biological father was unknown. When Eleanor died in a car accident in 1992, she asked Richard to raise Sienna as his own, which he did for 32 years, by changing her last name to Sterling. But he never legally adopted her. Edward brought up the text of the Revocable Living Trust on screen, reading Section 3, Subsection B, which stated that beneficiaries shall include only biological children of the grantor, or legally adopted children with adoption finalized through court proceedings. Since Sienna was neither Richard's biological child nor his legally adopted child, she had zero inheritance rights, and the trust revocation was legally binding. Sienna stood again, with tears streaming down her face, shouting that I'd lied to her for 32 years. I stood as well, and told her calmly that I didn't lie, but raised her as my daughter because I loved her mother, and promised to take care of her, giving her my name, my company, and every opportunity. But when I discovered she was poisoning me, and realized she valued my money more than my life, I had the DNA test re-examined and made a choice to protect Sophie by petitioning for full custody, because Sienna was not fit to be her mother. Sienna lunged toward me, screaming that I couldn't take her daughter, but two bailiffs moved fast and grabbed her arms before she could reach the gallery railing. Judge Holloway declared her in contempt and ordered her to sit down, and Sienna collapsed into her chair, sobbing that she wasn't even a Sterling anymore, that she was nobody with nothing. Judge Holloway admitted the DNA evidence into the record and found that Sienna had no legal standing to contest the trust revocation, because she was neither Richard's biological child nor his legally adopted child. Furthermore, given the severity of the criminal charges and evidence that Sienna used her minor daughter in a fraud scheme, the judge issued a temporary order suspending Sienna's parental rights and granting me temporary full custody of Sophie, effective immediately. Sienna's voice came out as a broken whisper, begging not to lose Sophie. But Judge Holloway's expression didn't soften as she explained that Sienna had poisoned her father figure for 5 years and used her daughter as bait, forfeiting her right to custody. The courtroom began to empty as bailiffs prepared to escort Sienna back to county jail. But she turned in her seat and called out to Sophie, desperately saying she loved her and was sorry and begging for forgiveness. Sophie stood slowly with Margaret beside her, and for a long moment locked eyes with Sienna across the courtroom. Sophie's voice was soft but steady as she told her mother that she'd hurt Grandpa Rick for 5 years and asked Sophie to help trap him, and she couldn't forgive that maybe someday, but not now. Sophie turned away and walked to where I stood, waiting, wrapping her arms around me and burying her face in my jacket as I held her. She told me she was sorry and knew Sienna was still her mom, but she chose me, and I felt tears in my eyes as I told her she had nothing to be sorry for because she saved my life. The doors closed behind Sienna, and Edward looked at me saying it was over. But I replied quietly that tomorrow she'd accept the plea deal of 15 years in federal prison, because going to trial meant facing Sophie on the witness stand again. Sophie took my hand, and we walked out of the courtroom together, while behind us Sienna sat alone at the defense table for a few more seconds before the bailiffs came back to take her away. For 32 years, she had been Richard Sterling's daughter, or so she believed. But in 15 minutes, she learned she was Eleanor Sterling's daughter from an unknown father, raised by an uncle who had loved her despite the lie. Tomorrow, the plea deal would be signed, and the Sterling protocol would be complete. 30 days after the DNA revelation shattered Sienna's identity in open court, she stood before Judge Holloway in an orange jumpsuit and prepared to accept 15 years in federal prison. The alternative was going to trial, which meant facing Sophie's testimony again and hearing her daughter read from that diary while a jury watched, and Sienna couldn't survive that. On the 28th day after the hearing, she had finally whispered the words that ended it all, telling Diana Blackwood she couldn't let Sophie testify at trial and couldn't see her on that stand again reading from that diary, so she'd take the 15 years. The plea negotiations had unfolded over those 30 days, with each defendant calculating their odds and choosing survival over defiance. Dr. Martin Keene had been the first to fold on the 10th day, accepting 8 years in federal prison for medical fraud and conspiracy, along with permanent revocation of his medical license. Bradley Vaughn had tried to negotiate down to 8 years, but the prosecutors refused to budge, and on the 15th day, he accepted 12 years for wire fraud embezzlement and accessory to elder abuse, along with full restitution of $8 million from his frozen offshore accounts. Sienna's plea came last on the 28th day, after Diana laid out the stark math: accept 15 years, or go to trial and face 20 to 25, with 99% conviction rate. Sienna signed the agreement with shaking hands and pleaded guilty to elder abuse, wire fraud embezzlement, and conspiracy, accepting 15 years with no parole, $12 million in restitution, and parental rights permanently terminated with full custody of Sophie granted to me. The sentencing hearing convened on the 37th day since the arrest, with the courtroom packed again. Judge Holloway announced she would hear victim impact statements before imposing sentences, and I stood and walked to the podium with my voice composed and steady. I explained that 32 years ago, I made a promise to my dying sister to raise her daughter as my own, and I kept that promise by giving Sienna my name, my company, my fortune, and my unconditional love. The evidence presented to this court speaks for itself: 5 years of systematic harm designed not to kill, but to control. I told the judge that medical experts said I'd recover physically, but some damage can't be undone. For 5 years, I believed I was losing my mind, becoming a burden. But the worst part wasn't what she did to me. It was what she did to Sophie, forcing an 11-year-old to become a witness against her own mother. Sophie stood next and walked to the podium holding a piece of paper with her handwriting covering both sides. Her voice was soft but steady as she explained that for 6 months she watched her mom poison her grandpa every morning, and though she didn't know what the powder was at first, she knew it was wrong because her mom was hiding it. She started writing everything down in her diary, taking pictures and recording videos, because she loved her grandpa more than she was scared of her mom. When she told me what she saw, I didn't get mad, but hugged her and said she was brave, asking her to keep documenting so we could stop her mom from hurting me. She felt bad because Sienna was her mom, but her mom had hurt me for 5 years and asked Sophie to help trap me, and Sophie couldn't let that happen. She loved me because I was the only person who really listened to her, read to her, helped with homework, and made her feel safe while her mom was always too busy with work or her boyfriend. She didn't want her mom to go to prison forever, but didn't want to live with her anymore, wanting instead to live with me. Judge Holloway imposed sentences starting with Dr. Keene receiving 8 years with permanent license revocation and $75,000 in restitution. Then Bradley Vaughn receiving 12 years with $8 million in restitution. Turning to Sienna, the judge called this the most egregious elder abuse case she'd seen in 20 years, noting that the DNA evidence proved Sienna was not my biological daughter, but my niece. Yet I had chosen to raise her as my own, an act of love repaid with betrayal. Judge Holloway sentenced Sienna to 15 years in federal prison with no parole eligibility. $12 million in restitution, parental rights permanently terminated, and custody of Sophie granted to me. The gavel struck, and the bailiffs moved to escort the defendants out. Sienna turned in her seat with hands cuffed in front of her and looked at me across the courtroom, her voice broken and desperate, as she said she'd given me 30 years of her life. I stood and met her eyes without flinching, telling her she'd spent 5 of them poisoning mine, and that she'd had everything including a family fortune company and daughter who loved her. But it wasn't enough, because she wanted more, and in trying to take everything, she lost everything. When she whispered that she was sorry, I told her she was sorry she got caught, and there was a difference. Then said goodbye. I turned and walked toward the exit with Sophie's hand in mine without looking back, as Sienna's voice rose in a desperate plea, asking if I would tell Sophie she loved her. I stopped at the doorway, but didn't turn around, telling her that Sophie already knew she loved her. But what Sophie didn't know was why that wasn't enough to stop her from hurting me. And maybe in 15 years, she could explain it to Sophie herself. We walked out of the courtroom together with the last sound being Sienna sobbing as the bailiffs led her away. The doors closed, and the sound cut off. And outside the courthouse, we walked past the media cameras toward the car, waiting at the curb, while the prison transport van pulled away, carrying Sienna Sterling, who looked out the barred window at the San Francisco skyline, knowing that in 15 years she'd be 50, Sophie would be 26, I would be 77. And by then, the Sterling name I had given her out of love would be nothing but a memory of a woman who confused wealth with worth and lost both. 10 days after the sentencing, I stood on the deck of the Navigator, a yacht I'd purchased years ago for moments exactly like this, and watched Sophie paint a sunset she'd never seen before. We were anchored off Sapphire Cay, a private island in the Caribbean, where the water was turquoise and the sand was white, and the only sounds were waves and seabirds. The yacht was 150 feet of teak and mahogany, but what mattered most was that it was far from San Francisco, far from courtrooms and federal prisons and poisoned coffee. Sophie sat cross-legged on the deck, with a watercolor set I'd given her for her birthday, her tongue sticking out in concentration as she tried to capture the way the light turned gold at the horizon. She wore a sundress and no shoes, looking like what she was, an 11-year-old girl who had been through too much and was finally learning how to be a child again. She looked up from mixing red and orange on her palette, asking if the color was right for the sky because it looked too pink. I knelt beside her and told her it was perfect, because sunsets don't have a right color, they're different every night, and that's what makes them special. When she asked if they were like people, I smiled and said exactly like people. Dinner was served just after 7 o'clock, with grilled fish caught that morning, rice, vegetables, and mango slices that Sophie devoured. We ate in comfortable silence until Sophie put down her fork and looked at me with the expression she always wore when working up courage to ask something difficult. She wanted to know why her mom did it, why she poisoned me. I took a breath and reminded her about the night at the Apex, when I gave her mom the $100 bill that was actually worth $18,000, explaining that her mom didn't see the value and only saw the number printed on it. That's how she saw me too, looking at an old man who was slowing down and getting in her way, rather than the person who raised her and loved her and gave her everything. She only saw an obstacle between her and money, confusing wealth with worth, and thinking money would make her happy when real wealth is having people who love you and would risk everything to save you. Like Sophie documenting everything in her diary to save my life. Sophie's voice became small as she asked if she was going to be like her mom, worried that kids turn out like their parents. I knelt in front of her and took her hands, telling her she was nothing like her mother because when she was 10 years old, she had a choice between protecting her mother by staying quiet or protecting me by documenting evidence and telling the truth. She chose love over fear and truth over comfort, while her mother made the opposite choice every single day for 5 years. Real value isn't in what you own, but in who you love and who loves you back. And Sophie already understood that at 11, while her mother still didn't understand it at 35. Sophie asked if it was bad that she missed her mom sometimes, and I told her that was human, that she was allowed to love her and be angry at her at the same time, because those feelings can exist together. Later that evening, after the sky turned purple and the first stars appeared, Sophie fell asleep on one of the deck lounge chairs, and I covered her with a blanket, sitting beside her and thinking about how 32 years ago I had held a 3-year-old girl whose mother had just died, and promised Eleanor I would raise her daughter as my own. I kept that promise, but somewhere along the way, that little girl became someone I didn't recognize, who valued money more than love and greed more than loyalty, and in the end, she destroyed herself. Sophie was different, risking everything at 11 years old to save me by documenting her own mother's crimes because she knew it was right. I lost a daughter who was never really mine, but saved a granddaughter who always was. And looking at Sophie sleeping on that deck, safe and free from poisoned coffee and conspiracy, I knew I had made the right choice. Sophie woke around 9 o'clock, and we stood at the railing watching the last sliver of sun sink into the ocean, with the sky a riot of orange and pink and purple. She asked what we were going to do now, and I told her we could go anywhere she wanted, because the world is big and we have time. When she asked if we could go to Paris to see the Eiffel Tower, I smiled and said we'd spend the summer there, and she could paint the Seine. And after that, maybe Italy or Japan or back here. Because the point was, we have time now with no poison, no conspiracy, no courtrooms. Just her and me building a new life where people matter more than money. The sun dipped below the horizon, and the sky turned deep purple as the first stars emerged. Sophie leaned against the railing and told me she loved me, and I pulled her close, telling her I loved her too, more than all the money in the world. We stood there in the gathering darkness, with the yacht glowing with warm light from the cabin windows, 2 silhouettes on the deck against the endless Caribbean Sea. I had built Vanguard systems from nothing and turned a garage startup into a $350 million empire, creating wealth that most people only dream of. But in the end, wealth couldn't save me from arsenic in my coffee or protect me from a daughter who valued my money more than my life. What saved me was love, an 11-year-old girl with a diary and the courage to tell the truth, and that was real wealth and what mattered most. Sienna spent 5 years trying to take everything from me, but in the end, she took nothing because the things that mattered most, she could never touch: my granddaughter's love, my freedom, my life. Standing on that yacht deck watching Sophie paint her 100th sunset in the days to come, I realized I hadn't lost a daughter, but finally found my... When everything finally settled and the courtroom doors closed for the last time, I found myself thinking about how family betrayal leaves scars that no amount of money can heal. The person you raised, the one you gave your name and your fortune to, chose poison over gratitude, and that choice changes everything. This is one of those grandpa stories people might struggle to believe, but it taught me lessons I wish I'd understood decades earlier when there was still time to course correct. My advice to anyone who'll listen: don't let wealth blind you to character. I spent 30 years building Vanguard systems from a garage startup into a $350 million enterprise. And somewhere along the way, I made a dangerous assumption that success would naturally cultivate loyalty and love in those around me. I was profoundly mistaken. Money doesn't attract devotion. It attracts opportunists who see you as a means to an end, not as a human being worthy of care and respect. If I could go back and do it differently, I'd have paid far more attention to the small moments that revealed character, rather than chasing the next quarterly earnings report or board meeting. That night at the Apex, when Sienna threw away an $18,000 collector's note because she couldn't see past the $100 denomination printed on its face, should have been my wake-up call. That single moment revealed everything I needed to know about how she valued things versus how she valued people. But I ignored it. I made excuses. I told myself she was stressed, that she'd had a long day, that she didn't understand what she was holding. The mind has an incredible capacity for self-deception when it desperately wants to believe the best about someone you love. Family betrayal doesn't arrive with trumpets and warning signs. It doesn't send you an email announcing its intentions. It creeps in, quietly disguised behind familiar smiles and routine gestures like morning coffee delivered at 7:30 every day. In my case, it manifested as arsenic trioxide dissolved into my favorite blue mug 5 to 10 milligrams at a time. Calculated not to kill me outright, but to make me appear confused and incompetent.